Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Jeremy Corbyn was given numerous standing ovations today as he delivered his keynote conference speech. He said Labour was on the threshold of power, mocked Tory disunity and insisted Labour policies were now mainstream. On Brexit, he accused the Tories of spending more time arguing with each other than negotiating with the EU. In a speech that promised a greater role for the state, Mr Corbyn said Labour would reform the rental sector in housing. Referring to the Grenfell Tower disaster, he said it was time to end a political system that had shown disdain for the powerless and the poor. Our political editor Laura Koonsberg was in Brighton for the speech.
No need to hesitate anymore.
The leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn.
He knows he'll walk out to rapture. Every time his fans make his entrance. "2 minutes and 32 seconds of chanting and applause is adoration and belief."
Conference, thank you so much for that wonderful welcome and this incredible feeling and spirit and unity and love and affection we have here.
He's much more than a contender now.
Against all predictions, in June we won the largest increase in the Labour vote since 1945. And achieved Labour's best vote for a generation. It's a result which has put the Tories on notice and Labour on the threshold of power.
After tensions round the edges of conference, he demanded that any political abuse done in his name comes to an end. But there were boos for the Tories' deal with the DUP and sharp words from him on their record.
This coalition of chaos is no joke. Just look at the record since the Conservatives have been in office. NHS waiting lists lengthening, school class sizes growing and teachers leaving. Over 4 million children now living in poverty. And condemned by the United Nations for violating the rights of disabled people. That's not strong and stable, it's callous and it's calculating.
On the challenge of Brexit, the party's top brass has settled on a broad position that just about contains the party's differences.
One thing needs to be made clear straight away. 3 million European Union citizens currently living and working in Britain are welcome here. So, Theresa May, please, if you're watching, and I'm sure you are, give them the full guarantees they deserve today. Because if you don't, we will when we're in government.
He repeated Labour's promise to cap rents and promised council tenants the chance to stop redevelopment in their area and to stay in their homes if it happens.
Rent controls exist in many cities across the world. And I want our cities to have those powers too, and tenants to have those protections. No social cleansing, no jacking up of rents, no exorbitant ground rents.
But then the man who was considered on the fringes of his own party for years made his bravest claim, that you have moved. The public sentiments and beliefs now align with him.
Conference, it's often said that elections can only be won from the centre ground. And, all right, in a way, that's not wrong, so long as it's clear that the political centre of gravity isn't fixed or unmovable. A new consensus is emerging from the great economic crash and the years of austerity to when people started to find a political voice for their hopes for something different and something better. 2017 may be the year when politics finally caught up with the crash of 2008. That's the real centre of gravity in politics. We are now the political mainstream. Yes. Labour can and Labour will deliver a Britain for the many, not the few.
New jubilation with some of the old songs.
I think that's one of the seminal moments in the history of the Labour Party.
It was absolutely inspirational.
What about the family?
What did you think about it?
I thought it was wonderful.
Oh, fantastic.
It's many years since a political speech has made people feel like this.
Jeremy Corbyn has changed and Labour has changed. After 2 years of nearly constant bickering, the leader is now in total control, sustained by the hopes of his legions of supporters. Yet even inside this bubble of confidence, at the top of the party, there is an awareness they can't count on that forever or rely on the excitement you can see and feel here in Brighton, sending him to number 10.
A huge job still to carry that feeling to every corner. Ground shifts. Yes, the country's edges are forever moving, but it is for you, not any politician, to draw the lines. Laura Kunzberg, BBC News, Brighton.
Now, in a moment, we'll speak to Laura in Brighton, but first, our home editor, Mark Easton, is here with me. There was a key section, Mark, on housing, on rent control. I mean, will it work?
Well, it's very, very popular because it addresses a real concern for millions of people. They can't afford the rent. But, you know, one Swedish economist described rent control as the most efficient technique presently known to destroy a city except for bombing. And he was a socialist, incidentally. The phrase rent control sends a shiver down the spine of landlords who argue that if you restrict their profits, actually what will happen is that you'll hit the quality and the quantity of what's on offer because people will either cut corners or they'll withdraw from the market altogether. However, many countries do have some form of rent control. Indeed, Britain had it for most of the 20th century. And there are two kinds. There is a cap on the rent level, and with that, most economists would say that won't improve supply of decent, affordable homes. And what the Labour calls the second generation and its favoured option, that's a cap on any increase in rents. Labour suggesting city mayors in England could perhaps limit rent increases to inflation or even 1% below inflation. Now, there are examples of the successful use of this policy, but it's got to be applied well. You do it wrongly and it can either be ineffective or it can be counterproductive.
Thank you, Mark. Well, Laura, let me come to you in Brighton. I lost count of the number of standing ovations Jeremy Corbyn had, but do we know that these policies are mainstream, as he says?
Well, the centre ground, that fabled phrase, used to be rather sneered at by people on Labour's left like Jeremy Corbyn. There was a sense if you said you were mainstream, you might have to somehow sacrifice your dearly held principles in order to win. But, you know, since the election, Jeremy Corbyn, I think, has now got the confidence to say publicly what he and his team have felt for some time, is that the recession and the years that followed have changed this country, and therefore they have changed people's desires and they have changed people's appetite for bigger and bolder change. And put bluntly, that's why they believe that Jeremy Corbyn's ideas, which were out of fashion in the Labour Party for a long, long time, are now firmly back in vogue. Now, the activists here absolutely loved it. We saw pure adoration here. And the party thinks that with the government shaky, politics has been so volatile, that they've got a real opportunity to get this message out and to keep building and building and building his support. That said, a great mood among activists at the end of a party conference does not necessarily translate into big political gains. Labour has made huge progress in the last few months, but keeping up that pace, that's a big, tall order.
All right, Laura, thank you very much.
Jeremy Corbyn didn't just make a pitch for power at the Labour conference today, although he did exactly that. His words went much further. The lengthy speech was also both a blistering attack on the current government and a proposal to transform Britain's political landscape. More than a quarter of the speech was taken up by bursts of cheering and applause. But at the core of Mr Corbyn's vision was his claim that the centre ground of British politics has shifted and that his Labour is now the mainstream. Our political editor Robert Peston now on a speech aimed at defining a new political era.
Happy clappy Labour, celebrating a return from the dead, which seemed to be their dire fate only a year ago. And here was their hero, their star, for one afternoon only. Was he embarrassed by the rapture?
It's quite infectious, and let's make sure the whole country's infected with the same thing. So we meet here this week as a united party. Labour is ready to tackle inequality, ready to rebuild our National Health Service, ready to give opportunity to young people, dignity and security to all older people.
There was the odd laugh.
During the election campaign, Theresa May told voters they faced the threat of a coalition of chaos. Do you remember that? Well, now they're showing us just exactly how that works.
But this was, over 90 minutes, a longer speech than any given by a Labour leader in living memory, the most socialist programme for change we've heard in decades from a party on the apparent brink of power. It was about
asking the richest and the largest corporations to start paying their fair share. Not simply to redistribute within a system that isn't delivering for most people, but to transform that system.
And unlike his new Labour predecessors, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, no attempt at all to woo media enemies.
One paper devoted 14 pages to attacking the Labour Party, and the following day our vote went up nearly 10%. So this is a message to the Daily Mail's editor. Next time, please make it 28 pages.
On Brexit, he made, well, a courageous claim.
Labour is the only party that can bring together those who voted Leave and those who backed Remain, and unite the country for a future beyond Brexit.
There was a smidgen of new policy to control rents and give more power to council house tenants.
After Grenfell, we must think again about what are called regeneration schemes. Regeneration under a Labour government will be for the benefit of the local people, not private developers, not property speculators.
His big bet, well, that the centre of British politics has shifted decisively to the left.
A new consensus is emerging from the great economic crash and the years of austerity, when people started to find a political voice for their hopes for something different and something better.
Yes, they're flying the reddest Labour flag for generations, but will the country?
So, Robert, what is your assessment then of where Labour and Mr Corbyn are at the end of the conference?
This was a speech, Mary, like none we've heard from the leader of a major party for years and years, because Jeremy Corbyn spoke what he actually believes and has believed for something like 50 years. So there were, for example, attacks on Israel's treatment of Palestinians, attacks on arms sales to Saudi Arabia, calls for the utility companies to be nationalised. As I say, he's held these views for decades. He hasn't moved. He thinks the country is moving very much towards him, moving in a leftward direction. Now, you would look at the result of the last election and say there is evidence for that. What we don't know, however, is how much of Labour's surge was due to the appalling campaign, in many people's view, conducted by the Tories. So he is taking a risk in being so honest about what he believes and where he wants to take Labour. As I say, it could be a historic moment because this could be a major change in our political habits. but we don't know for sure yet.
All right, Robert Peston in Brighton, thank you.
Well, in his closing speech to the Labour conference in Brighton, Jeremy Corbyn declared the wreckage of the Grenfell Tower a tragic monument to what he called the degraded regime of neoliberal capitalism. Mr. Corbyn said Labour under his leadership was now a government in waiting, pledging to transform the British economy with a new and dynamic role for the public sector. His speech was greeted with rapture by Labour delegates. Here's our political editor, Gary Gibbon.
A pounding video of their superhero announced his arrival, but they didn't need pumping up. A year ago, he was still under threat from his own MPs, but the snap election, which was meant to see him crumple, saw Labour deny the Tories a majority in the election.
We bring the conference to order, if you think.
For decades, he was the dissident backbencher. Today, he felt he could rewrite Tony Blair's textbook of how you win elections.
Conference, it's often said that elections can only be won from the centre ground. And, all right, in a way, that's not wrong, so long as it's clear that the political centre of gravity isn't fixed or unmovable. 2017 may be the year when politics finally caught up with the crash of 2008. Because we offered people a clear choice, we need to build a still broader consensus around the priorities we set in the election campaign, making the case for both compassion and collective aspiration. That's the real centre of gravity in politics. We are now the political mainstream. Yes?
He said Britain had taken a 4-decade excursion down the wrong path, and the country was now realising that.
There is a new common sense emerging about how the country should be run. That's what we fought for in the election. And that's what's needed to replace the broken model forged by Margaret Thatcher many years ago. And the Financial Times put it last month that our financial system still looks a lot like the pre-crisis one. And this isn't from the Financial Times, this other bit. The capitalist system still faces a crisis of legitimacy stemming from the crash. Now is the time that government took a more active role in restructuring our economy.
Jeremy Corbyn said what he called the Tories' extractive model of capitalism. Their disdain for the poor was epitomised by the Grenfell Tower fire.
Now that degraded regime has a tragic monument. The chilling wreckage of Grenfell Tower. A horrifying fire in which dozens perished. An entirely avoidable human disaster.
He promised new powers for councils to set rent controls and said Labour would insist residents get more control over regeneration plans.
Regeneration is a much abused word. Too often, what it really means is forced gentrification and social cleansing.
He attacked President Trump's foreign and domestic policy as disturbing and alarming.
The values we share are not served by building walls. Banning immigrants on the basis of religion, polluting the planet, or pandering to racism.
The parties had to fend off more claims of anti-Semitism this week by some activists. Jeremy Corbyn said all abuse was intolerable, and the Tories and their newspaper supporters had directed lots of it at one of their own.
And no one was the target of that more than Diane Abbott.
Rapturous applause, and then the party atmosphere of the week broke through again.
Happy birthday, dear Diane. Happy birthday to you.
Not how leaders' speeches normally go, but this is a party turned upside down. Ones who know the words are now in charge. Jeremy Corbyn said he'd keep the pressure on the government up over Brexit, but his heart seemed more in an older project, expanding the state, reining in capitalism. He said he hoped the excitement here for that would infect the country.
Gary Gibbon with Labour in Brighton.
Just one other story this evening. Jeremy Corbyn closed his conference in Brighton today, promising to deliver power for the people, calling on the Conservatives to make way. He insisted his manifesto promises represented a new common sense, which puts the party in the mainstream of public opinion. Our political editor, Nick Watt, was listening to the speech in Brighton. He sent this report.
In the pantheon of political leaders, from left to right, a handful stand out for a rare quality. They defined the centre ground in their day. Clement Attlee and the welfare state, Margaret Thatcher and the curbing of unions. Today, Jeremy Corbyn added his name to this illustrious list as he declared that he now embodies a new centre ground in what he believes will be the post-austerity era.
Today's centre ground is certainly not where it was 20 or 30 years ago. A new consensus is emerging from the great economic crash and the years of austerity to when people started to find a political voice for their hopes for something different and something better. "2017 may be the year when politics finally caught up with the crash of 2008.
So, an ecstatic Glastonbury-style standing ovation for Jeremy Corbyn there. This was a relaxed and confident performance as he said he is now reshaping the political centre ground and Labour represents the mainstream in this country now. But Jeremy Corbyn did acknowledge that even after its success in the June general election, his party is still in opposition. His challenge is to take the enthusiasm from this hall and to reach out to parts of Britain that have yet to be persuaded by his leadership.
Jeremy Corbyn wants to remain true to his radical roots whilst delivering practical changes. In light of the Grenfell disaster, which he said had highlighted a failed approach to housing, a future Labour government would give existing social housing tenants a veto over redevelopment schemes.
Regeneration is a much abused word. Too often, what it really means is forced gentrification and social cleansing. As private developers move in and tenants and leaseholders are moved out.
We're going to be seeing a Labour government led by Jeremy Corbyn, and it is going to be fantastic. I can tell you that right now. I look forward to it with such glee!
Jeremy is absolutely assured now of his position as our leader, and I think that shows, doesn't it, when you are that more comfortable speaker. It's come over as the real Jeremy Corbyn, and I saw that on every single day I worked with him, the real man. I think we're seeing a bit more of the real Jeremy Corbyn, and that's a really good thing for our party.
I thought it was a really brilliant speech, and everybody in the hall thought it was great too, so I think we're on the move.
The stirring words of the red flag brought the Labour conference to a familiar end. This time, they actually believe it.
That was Nick Watt.